Long before charts, models, or economics textbooks existed, one man noticed something most systems still choose to ignore. Wealth does not rise in a straight line. Power does not accumulate forever. And unchecked prosperity carries the seeds of its own collapse. This wasn't a theory born in a university. It was a pattern observed in real life, written by someone who had personally witnessed empires rise, peak, and decay from the inside. Welcome to Stories Behind the Money, where power, ambition, and history collide. And every fortune has a hidden cost. In the 14th century, while Europe was struggling through plagues, wars, and feudal fragmentation, a North African thinker was quietly writing what may be the most accurate description of economic cycles ever produced. His name was Ibn Khaldun. Centuries before Adam Smith, Keynes, or modern macroeconomics, he explained why economies grow, why states expand, and why they eventually collapse under their own weight. Ibn Khaldun was born in 1332 in what is now Tunisia, and the world he was born into was anything but stable. Dynasties rose quickly and fell just as fast. Cities flourished, then emptied. Plagues moved through populations with brutal efficiency. Power constantly changed hands between rulers, tribes, and factions. This was not a calm environment for abstract theory. It was chaos, and that chaos became his laboratory. Ibn Khaldun was not a detached academic. He served in royal courts. He advised rulers. He watched governments mismanage wealth, overtax their people, lose legitimacy, and then act surprised when everything unraveled. Over time, he noticed something disturbing. The same story kept repeating. Different names, different religions, different locations, but the same pattern. Discipline turned into comfort. Comfort turned into decadence. Decadence turned into decline. What Ibn Khaldun understood, and what makes him so relevant today, is this. Economic systems are not machines. They are living social organisms. They depend on trust, on shared values, on incentives, on people believing in one another. And when those things weaken, no amount of gold, no amount of force, no amount of authority can hold the structure together. At the center of his thinking was a concept called asabiyya. It's often translated as social cohesion. But that barely scratches the surface. Asabiyya meant trust, shared purpose, the willingness to sacrifice for something larger than yourself. Economically, it was the invisible backbone of a society. Ibn Khaldun observed that societies with strong cohesion could become productive, resilient, and wealthy, even with limited resources. Because people trusted each other. Because they believed effort meant something. Because they defended their institutions and protected long-term stability. Wealth followed naturally. Not because they were rich to begin with, but because their structure allowed productivity to grow. And then, slowly, everything began to change. Success alters behavior. As wealth accumulated, elites drifted away from the productive base that created it. Rulers became isolated. Bureaucracies expanded. Power was inherited rather than earned. The discipline that built the system softened. Necessity was replaced by comfort. And cohesion quietly began to erode. Ibn Khaldun wasn't making a moral judgment. He wasn't blaming people for becoming lazy. He was describing incentives. When survival is no longer urgent, people take fewer risks. Innovation slows. Extraction becomes easier than creation. The state begins living off past success rather than present productivity. And that's where decline truly begins. One of the places where Ibn Khaldun saw this cycle most clearly was in taxation. He noticed something simple but powerful. In the early stages of a state, taxes are low. People work, they produce, they trade, they invest. Because what they gain is greater than what they give. Effort makes sense, and because of that, economic activity expands. Production grows, trade flourishes, and ironically, even with low taxes, government revenue rises. But then, the system matures. Courts grow larger. Armies expand. Bureaucracies thicken. Lifestyles become more expensive. And to finance all of this, taxes are raised. At first, this still works. Revenue continues to increase. The state feels strong. But this strength is an illusion. At some point, higher taxes begin to discourage production. People work less. They avoid risk. Trade slows. Investment declines. The tax base shrinks. And the state's response is predictable. Raise taxes again. Then again, and again. Each increase accelerates the decline. The state does not collapse because it taxed too little. It collapses because it taxed too much from a shrinking economy. Today, we call this diminishing returns. But Ibn Khaldun understood it centuries before the term existed. And here's what made his thinking different. He did not turn this into a moral debate. He didn't say low taxes were good and high taxes were evil. He said something much more important. Incentives matter. When people feel their effort is being punished rather than rewarded, they disengage. When capital is extracted faster than it can regenerate, the system weakens. States do not collapse from a lack of authority. They collapse because they consume the source of their own strength. Ibn Khaldun applied this same logic to government spending and corruption. As states age, rulers grow accustomed to luxury. Court life expands. Public money is no longer used to increase productivity, but to preserve status. Bureaucracies multiply. Positions are sold or inherited. Merit slowly disappears. And here's the key insight. Corruption rarely begins with criminal intent. It begins with normalization. Everyone adjusts, everyone adapts. The system doesn't feel broken, it feels deserved. But this has consequences. Spending grows faster than output. To compensate, taxes rise. To enforce compliance, coercion increases. Trust erodes. And as cohesion weakens, enforcement becomes more expensive and less effective. The state spends more and gets less, trapped inside a loop of its own making. And at this point, a question naturally arises. Does this really sound medieval? Because to translate Ibn Khaldun into modern language, you only need to change a few words. Replace dynasties with institutions. Replace courts with bureaucracies. Replace caravans with supply chains. The logic remains exactly the same. Because Ibn Khaldun wasn't describing medieval quirks, he was describing human behavior under power and prosperity. And perhaps his most important line was this: markets reflect people before they reflect numbers. Prices move because confidence moves. Productivity rises because incentives align. Decline does not begin with collapse. It begins quietly, with less trust, more extraction, and weaker cohesion. Ibn Khaldun did not believe cycles could be prevented, but he believed they could be understood. And in his view, awareness didn't stop decline. It removed illusion. It replaced surprise with clarity. And clarity, he believed, was the closest thing to control humans would ever have. If Ibn Khaldun were alive today, he wouldn't be impressed by our technology. He wouldn't be dazzled by the speed of markets, or the complexity of financial instruments, or the sophistication of economic language. He would look past the screens and spreadsheets and focus on what he always focused on: incentives, cohesion, power. And what he would see would feel painfully familiar. Modern economies like to believe they have escaped history. We talk about progress as if it moves in a straight line, always upward, always forward, always permanent. Each generation assumes it has finally solved the problem of instability. Better data, better policies, better institutions. But this is where Ibn Khaldun's most uncomfortable insight appears. The more advanced a system becomes, the cycle does not disappear. It accelerates. In today's world, asabiya still exists. It's just harder to recognize. It no longer looks like tribal loyalty or tight-knit communities. Now it appears as trust in institutions, confidence in currencies, belief in rules, willingness to cooperate inside massive, impersonal systems. When these are strong, economies grow. People invest. They plan long-term. Risk feels reasonable. But when they weaken, everything becomes short-term. People stop contributing. They start extracting. And this is where decline really begins. You can see this most clearly during boom periods. Early in an expansion, growth feels productive. New businesses appear. Innovation spreads. Returns are tied to real output. But success changes behavior. Capital concentrates. Barriers rise. Financial maneuvering begins to outperform real production. Wealth becomes less about creating value and more about positioning within the system. This is the modern version of what Ibn Khaldun described. Elites drifting away from the productive base. Governments face the same pressure. As economies grow, states expand with them. Programs multiply, rules increase. Administrative layers thicken. Expectations rise. None of this is evil. It's structural. Prosperity creates demands that only prosperity can temporarily sustain. But when growth slows, the commitments remain. The spending remains. And generating revenue becomes harder. This is where pressure builds. In the modern world, this pressure isn't managed only through taxes. It's managed through debt, through money creation, through pushing costs into the future. But the logic is unchanged. As Ibn Khaldun would say, when the cost of maintaining the system becomes greater than the perceived benefit of participating in it, cohesion erodes. People begin to disengage. Economically, politically, psychologically. Trust weakens. Compliance becomes fragile. This is where debt enters the story. Debt is delayed taxation. It allows societies to preserve their living standards without confronting declining productivity. For a while, it works. Markets remain calm. Growth appears stable. The system feels strong. But the underlying dynamic has not changed. The present is being funded by the future, and eventually the arithmetic becomes unavoidable. Ibn Khaldun would recognize this moment instantly. This is the phase where systems feel most confident and are actually most vulnerable, where appearance matters more than foundations, where leaders mistake temporary stability for permanent strength. This is not collapse. This is pre-collapse. What makes this cycle so persistent is that it doesn't require bad intentions. No one wakes up and says, "Let's destroy everything." Everyone makes decisions that feel rational in isolation. Individuals respond to incentives. Institutions protect themselves. Elites justify extraction. Each step makes sense. But taken together, the pattern is destructive. Modern financial markets amplify this dynamic. Asset prices rise faster than wages. Speculation outpaces production. Value detaches from reality. This creates the illusion of wealth without the cohesion to support it. And when corrections arrive, they don't just reset prices. They test belief. Who trusts the system? Who expects protection? Who pays the cost? Ibn Khaldun understood something fundamental. Legitimacy matters more than force. A state can compel compliance for a while, but it cannot compel productivity forever. When people stop believing the system works for them, participation declines, innovation slows, risk-taking collapses. The economy contracts not because resources vanish, but because cooperation does. This is why economic cycles feel so brutal. They aren't just financial. They are social realignments, power shifts, old structures weaken. New groups with stronger cohesion emerge. The cycle resets, not because history wants balance, but because incentives demand it. And here is the most unsettling part of Ibn Khaldun's message. He never promised escape. He did not believe wisdom could freeze systems at their peak. Decline to him was not a failure of intelligence. It was a consequence of success. The same forces that create wealth eventually undermine the conditions that made it possible. So what does this mean for the individual? Ibn Khaldun wasn't writing personal finance advice, but he left behind something more valuable: perspective. Understanding cycles doesn't make you immune to them, but it changes how you interpret them. You stop mistaking peaks for permanence. You stop confusing size with stability. You recognize shifts in incentives before prices reflect them. This is where real financial freedom quietly begins. Not with perfect timing, not with prediction, but with humility. With the understanding that systems are temporary, that confidence is fragile, and that cohesion is more valuable than any asset class. You don't need to outrun the cycle. You just need to stop being surprised by it. Ibn Khaldun's genius was not that he predicted the future. It was that he removed its mystery. By anchoring economics in human behavior, he made cycles visible. And once something is visible, it loses its power to shock. History does not repeat because people are foolish. It repeats because incentives remain stubbornly consistent. Ibn Khaldun saw this centuries before modern economics gave cycles names, charts, and equations. And his work reminds us of something simple and fragile. Beneath every market, every state, every financial system, there is the same foundation: trust. When trust holds, prosperity follows. When it fractures, decline begins. Quietly, slowly, long before the headlines catch up. And if this gave you a new perspective, don't forget to subscribe.